Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Take Two. I am really excited today to be talking to Larissa Maxwell. And Larissa, basically, her business is to change the world, if that isn't too broad of a definition. I first met Larissa when she was working on human trafficking, and a lot of the work that she does has to do with exploited and marginalized populations. So, Larissa, can we talk first about your work with temporary foreign workers or migrant workers? Because I think that's a really hot topic right now. Tell me about what you're doing and what is the situation with temporary workers in Canada?
Absolutely. So part of my work is what's called ESG consulting, anything to do with the environment, social or governance work. And so I tend to work quite a bit around supply chain and the human component of the supply chain. And in Canada, a big component to think about is our migrant workers. You know, at any point in time in Canada, we have at minimum 500,000 migrant workers coming from other countries to work here in our industries. And so I've worked in two tracks. The first is that I've actually done direct social service work with those who are migrant workers who've been exploited, abused, or trafficked. Those who have come legally to Canada and had a pretty horrific experience while they're here. That's included everything from safe houses to legal advocacy, mental health and addiction support, and leadership development. And then on the other side, currently right now, I'm working on quite a few projects that's seeking to elevate and raise the capacity and voice of migrant workers to actually speak to the supply chain they're a part of. Very often marginalized groups might be lightly consulted or asked to come to a meeting, but they're not always equipped to really be active leaders in that supply chain. And so I'm currently working on a few projects to raise and elevate their voice.
So give me some numbers. How big is the foreign worker population in Canada?
Absolutely. This is a program created by the government, and it was designed to be temporary. It's called the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. But it turns out it's actually a permanent program that has a continuing demand. So what it looks like is employers make a case to the government that they can't fill certain positions. And there's certain industries where that's really common. And so once they make that case to the government, they can apply to attract migrant workers to come to Canada from multiple countries, source countries. Some of the big countries we see would be Mexico, Guatemala, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and a few other areas, and Dubai as well as a really common source community. And so they come to Canada, and typically they have a certain period of time that they're to be here with a work permit that's tied to their industry. It's very rare that they're allowed to jump between industries. The most common industries that we see are agriculture, private households, which would be like caregiving, elder care, childcare. We also see quite high numbers in gas stations, accommodations, food service, animal cultivation, and food manufacturing. So they're permitted to be here for a certain period of time attached to an industry or employers. And then once that time is up, there's some opportunities to apply to stay longer, but in most cases, their time here in Canada comes to an end. One of the things we can say very clearly about the migrant worker program is that these are primarily jobs that Canadians don't want to do. So the migrant worker program is designed to address our unemployment crisis really that we have, and it's actually not getting better, it's getting worse. So just to give you a quick idea, Joanna, in 2017, we issued 340,000 new work permits. That's on top of the workers that are already here. That increased to 390 in 2018. And by 2019, we were already at 470,000. And looking at stats for 2020 and now 2021, it's just increasing. So this program is no longer temporary.
So how does it happen that people come in under a government program and yet are subjected to abuse and exploitation and all of those other terrible things that we hear about on a case-by-case basis? How does that happen? I don't get it.
Absolutely. I would argue from my perspective of working in this field and working with the government, there's a systemic failure. This is a system that was not designed well, and it's actually currently undergoing an overhaul because it's so poorly designed. So there's quite a few areas where abuse can happen because there's a few players in the mix. So just to give you an idea, when you have a source country, there's typically employment agencies and recruiters who work between that country and Canada. And over here in Canada, we've got the government and we've got employers. And so we've got these consultants and we've got these employment agencies running in between. And what often happens is that they can be fraudulent. They can promote a job that either doesn't exist, they can say it'll be paid more than it is, or more commonly, they'll charge an illegal recruitment fee. So they'll say, to get this job in Canada, it will cost you this much. It's actually illegal to do that. And what happens is most migrant workers can't pay those amounts. Anything from $5,000 to $70,000 to get this job in Canada. So what happens is often the recruiters and the immigration consultants, they might work with the employer and say, well, they owe me money. They can just work it off with you. And the employer pays the consultant. So in real terms, Joanna, this is debt bondage. This is actually the very first steps of debt bonded slavery. And this is happening to migrant workers all across Canada. The second piece that we see is that once they're here in Canada, there isn't a lot of supervision. So for example, caregivers that go into a private home, even in really, really nice communities, nobody checks up on them. Nobody makes sure that's a safe workplace. It's up to the worker to report abuses, and they often don't know the Canadian system of how to do that. And then lastly, we also see that migrant workers in general, they're not informed of their rights. What's called the low skill stream, which, I don't really like that term, but low skilled would be some of these industries we're talking about. We're not talking about bringing doctors over to Canada. Right. Agricultural workers, they're not informed of their rights, and they often don't even know what minimum wage is. So it's very easy for an employer to either not have a contract with them or just to be exploitive and not even pay them in gifts, only pay them partially. And then we can see abuses continue. There's, of course, some great employers of migrant workers, but there's also, including large companies who have significantly abused their employees, their migrant workers, and everything from violence, sexual assault, confinement, unsafe working conditions, wage theft, really, really dangerous work without appropriate equipment. So there's quite a few abuses that can happen and very few ways for it to be detected.
So it sounds to me that on the one hand, you're working with developing some leadership capacity and some more awareness, but it sounds like there needs to be a fairly significant overhaul of this whole program from the government side, as you say, to provide more scrutiny, to provide more information about rights. I can't imagine coming in as a caregiver into another country and another culture and somehow knowing what my rights are and how to protect them. It sounds like there's a major overhaul required.
You're absolutely right. And there's two main government bodies that are the players in this. There's ESDC, or Employment and Development Canada, and there's IRCC, Immigration Refugee Canada. And so they have been working together, and I am privileged to be at some of those tables. And there's two things that are being proposed to overhaul the system. And this is mostly because migrant workers have had the courage to engage in grassroots movements to speak up. So currently they're looking at overhauling the whole program, and those proposed changes.
That's okay, you just froze for a second, but no biggie.
How are we doing now?
We can just carry on.
Okay, great. So some of those proposed changes include some transparency chains. So the government will require a lot more of employers, which isn't the greatest news for employers because it's already quite a process to apply for workers, but we know it's absolutely essential. So they'll be required to submit their work contracts to the government. New requirements for the workplaces to be abuse-free and ready for inspection within hours of notice, not 24 hours notice. There's going to be a ban and a much stronger punishment for illegal recruitment fees, and also really pushing for reasonable access to healthcare, as most migrant workers I've walked with have had zero access, and it's actually really difficult to even get an MSP number when you don't have status here in British Columbia, and depending on your work permit. So that's sort of some of the sweeping changes that are currently in the discussion tables, and some migrant workers are invited to be at those tables that we're supporting. But the second is much bigger. So in other countries, including the UK, they have something called the Modern Slavery Act. It's actually within their criminal code, and it requires transparency in your supply chain from point to point. And that required transparency means companies will now be required to actually publish reports and submit them to the government of their supply chain of the steps they've been taking all the way along to ensure that it's ethical. And there'll actually be a designated commissioner to review this and recommend criminal charges should we repeatedly see employers, recruiters, or consultants engaging in unethical and criminal behavior in their supply chain. And so although there's been a little bit of enforcement up to this point, we've never seen something this big. It's not currently passed, but it has made it past a few rounds. And so these are all good steps, Joanna, to make sure that Canada is a free place for all people that come to work here.
Now, we all have experienced recently labor shortages. It seems that there isn't an industry that hasn't been touched. And at first we started thinking, well, it's just the tourist centers and because they're too expensive to live in and all that sort of thing. But I heard a demographics person talking about COVID having an impact on the shortage of workers because it's curtailed immigration. But that can't be the whole picture, right?
Yeah, I think that I've had a lot of people ask me that. COVID-19 has been one of the reasons Canadians are even remotely aware of migrant workers and actually becoming appreciative of their work because we're realizing, oh, we don't get our produce. Our elderly people don't get support if we don't have them. We don't have gas stations that are run or hotels that are run. But I will say COVID-19 is not the reason that we need more migrant workers. It's actually based on what's happening on an economic level in Canada. We do have a labor market shortage and what's considered, an economic market failure. Mm-hmm. And we have not been able to rectify that. We have jobs that Canadians don't want. And Joanna, it's interesting because when you look at developed countries throughout the world, this is what can happen. It's called creating new caste systems. So we're familiar with caste systems in other countries, but when you have a developed country, what happens is certain labor becomes undesirable because everyone's pursuing the Canadian dream or the American dream. There's just jobs that we don't value as much anymore. And so we see is that Canadians don't want to pursue those jobs, even though they have unemployment challenges. And so that's part of what's contributing. And so this internal caste system also means that we often treat that kind of labor as less than. We often don't question that we got a huge container of blueberries for $2.99. We don't question, is that even possible in a supply chain to actually consume something that is that cheap in this day and age rate of inflation? We don't ask those questions. So as consumers, we also do drive this need for migrant work. So there's actually more factors than COVID-19, but I will say it has brought to the forefront a newer appreciation. And it's also, I think, pointed out to Canadians that even though we want to think we're quite progressive, there's still some anti-immigration / racist undertones where we have this idea that people are coming to take our jobs. I can't explain how far from the truth that really is. Canada would not survive without migrant workers, and we are so lucky and blessed to have them here.
So the last thing I want to ask you is, are you hopeful or optimistic that the negative parts of this situation are changing?
Yes, I am. I don't think I'd be in this work if I didn't believe that with some advocacy, with investing in lived experience communities, with challenging systems and not just assuming we figured it out the first time around, we can make massive sweeping change. And the two things that I mentioned to you, these have been years in the making. There's hundreds of agencies, hundreds of migrant workers, and myself who've been at these tables advocating. And it's exciting that the government is listening. And perhaps, as you mentioned, COVID-19 might be a positive contributor because we're valuing our supply chain more. But we need to see these come into action. So I'm hopeful, Joanna, but I will not rest until we see this system transform. And we still have a ways to go. So I've got my work cut out for me.
Well, like I said, your whole business and your whole mission is to change the world. So I can only wish you the very best of luck with that.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thanks, Larissa.